Samuel Barber was born in March 1910 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He started writing music when he was 7 with a string of ambitious projects. At 10, he wrote an opera on a libretto by the family cook. When he was 11, he took up the organ, and most of his organ career was spent at the local Presbyterian church, where he made something like $1,800 a month in today's money. In the spring of 1926, Barber had written enough songs to put on a full recital of these songs at his house, attended, by Barber's recollection, by about 100 people. Barber always had his sights set on being a composer, and he had a pretty supportive network of family and friends, except for his direct nuclear family. Barber was born into privilege and relied on domestic help to an almost comic degree. His mother, Marguerite, was his first piano teacher and helped her son premiere his fantasy for a piano duo when he was only 14. His father, Lauri, was less sympathetic. He wanted his son to go to Princeton, and from there into medicine. In a largely musical family, his biggest musical influence was his uncle, Sidney Homer. Until Homer's death, he would encourage Barber to strive ever higher in his creative work.
Sidney Homer counseled Barber during his early years and steered him away of pursuing what might be faddish or fashionable during the period, and advised him to keep his eyes on the eternal verities of truth and beauty, which he saw reflected, as far as music goes, as the great German composers. The regard with which he held Homer was indicated by the fact that he oversaw publication of 17 songs of Sidney Homer that Schirmer put out. And he said very, very complimentary things about Sidney Homer's songs throughout his life. He regarded them as some of the best American music of its time, and Homer is one of the first great American composers. It wasn't only Sidney Homer who was important to Barber, it was his wife, Louise, one of the leading American operatic contraltos of the period. I mean, she was a superstar at the Met. Aunt Louise would correct some of his vocal compositions. Uncle Sid would give him advice about being a composer. So they were both very, very instrumental and important figures.
In 1924, Barber auditioned at the famed Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, then just opening its doors.
Barber had access to some of the finest musicians of his generation who were studying there. He had the best singers and instrumentalists and pianists and string players eager to collaborate with him, to play his music. So that was a great resource for him that probably kept him at Curtis for as long as it did.
The 14-year-old Barber was the second person to enter the doors of Curtis when it first opened, and he would prove to be a fixture there for many years to come. In high school, Barber went to Curtis on Friday mornings, Philadelphia Orchestra concerts in the evenings. In all, Barber would spend almost a decade at Curtis, and for 8 years he studied composition with Rosario Scalero. He juggled piano and voice lessons most of the time as well, more than dabbling in conducting and carillon playing, and taking almost 100 hours of French and English between 1926 and 1928 alone. To Scalero, counterpoint, note against note, was the key to all elements of music. Harmony was just the result of good counterpoint.
Eventually they would be writing canons and fugues, motets, works in the great contrapuntal forms of Western Europe. And if you look at the compositions that were performed even in composition recitals at Curtis, one would find a lot of the students' fugues and canons and motets and so forth performed. That's what you needed to do before you were even allowed to write a free composition under Scalero, and that could take years.
The first 2 years of study under Scalero were all counterpoint all the time, but here's the catch. He wouldn't even so much as examine your counterpoint if he thought the themes that you wrote weren't good. It had to be good music first and foremost, even as an exercise, and he wouldn't take you through anything. He'd say, bring me a fugue next week, and the student asked him, well, how do I write a fugue? I've never written a fugue before. He'd say, figure it out yourself. A marvelous principle, one student remarked, but a painful way to learn.
Towards the end of the time with Scalero, you were to write an overture in a classical form or a work of that nature, something a little bit more free and a little bit more ambitious.
Scalero was a hard-driving pedagogue of the old world, old school. His tastes did not extend beyond the most conservative composers then living. And while he could be an annoying taskmaster for sure, there was nobody that Barber respected more, even when their personalities and their tastes clashed. Barber only ever studied under Scalero, a rare and remarkable exclusivity.
There was perhaps some wariness about studying with a teacher who was going to steer him to a certain aesthetic orientation or stylistic orientation. Barber wanted his independence. He just wanted to get the technique that he felt like he needed, then go on his own.
The Great Depression muted the family's finances, and it forced Curtis to lay off faculty, including Scalero, for the 1933-34 academic year. Growing antsy with life at Curtis and not really wanting to switch professors, Barber's prize-winning overture allowed him to continue study with Scalero in Italy in the summer of 1933. Barber was fast feeling like a big fish in a small pond at Curtis, which he described as a place where composers were made to feel inferior to virtuoso performers, an attitude encouraged by the Institute's director, Joseph Hoffmann, who reportedly had no belief in Americans to compose anything. Barber graduated from Curtis as the world was still in the throes of the Great Depression, and his music, the Cello Sonata, Dover Beach for voice and string quartet, and the School for Scandal Overture, would, in time, enter the repertoire. Barber had some early champions, but lacked a publisher, and outside Philadelphia and the Curtis network was really unknown. It would be 3 more years before he would sign with G. Schirmer, who brought out all these pieces and several others. They'd be his exclusive publisher for the rest of his life. In gratitude, Barber dedicated his first essay for orchestra to Carl Engel, then the president of Schirmer. It would be the beginning of a long and fruitful partnership with the company, which sought to hire him as director of publication in 1944. Barber, with this piece, thus invented the genre of the orchestral essay, and would produce 2 more in his career, the third being his final completed work. Another Scalero student entered Curtis in fall 1928 and roomed with Barber at his Spruce Street brownstone. Gian Carlo Menotti came from a wealthy northern Italian family and was obsessed with opera, and when his father died, Arturo Toscanini suggested Curtis as a place that he could go.
Menotti and Barber found that they had lots in common, including certain aesthetic orientation. Menotti would refer to Barber as one of his composition teachers, too. Barber had a very strong influence over Menotti, so Barber sort of led the way in the early years of their relationship.
Menotti knew no English, but both he and Barber spoke French. The 2 composers differed in their temperaments, but they were both hard, dedicated workers whose music was more conservative and thus bucked some of the stylistic trends of the time. Barber criticized, edited, and even orchestrated some of Menotti's music, and Menotti encouraged Barber to make edits and revisions to his scores. Barber introduced Menotti to the German Romantics. Menotti got Barber into opera.
I would say that their relationship fell under the category of sort of an open secret. People around them often knew that they were gay and had a romantic relationship, but there were other people that were very close to them, including close family members, who didn't know that they were gay. Certainly they supported each other enormously. They had great admiration for each other's work, which was important. Barber looked to Menotti as a great critic of his work. He said Menotti was one of the best critics that he knew. Menotti tells a humorous story about a little ceremony that they had to perform every time Barber would begin a new work, in which Barber would ask Menotti about if he liked this idea, and until Menotti said, "Oh, marvelous! Oh, wonderful! That's a wonderful idea," that would encourage Barber to continue on with the composition. So there was a lot of mutual reinforcement between the two. And then they even, of course, collaborated. Barber's first opera and second opera, Vanessa and Hannah Bridge, were both written to librettos by Menotti.
Both Barber and Menotti were fortunate to have gone to Curtis, not only for the network of top musicians there, but because its founder, Mary Louise Curtis Bach, was especially generous in her support of what she called the boys. She made sure that their lives were comfortable. Barber and Menotti shared a home, which they called Capricorn, in Mount Kisco, New York, for 3 decades. Menotti bought it in 1943 when Barber was in the Army, about which more later, but it wouldn't have been possible without Mary's generosity. "Just go and buy whatever house you want," she told them. Capricorn was originally a hunting lodge, and was large enough for Barber and Menotti to have their own private wings, while also having room for entertaining guests.
It was important for them to have a lot of separated space so that both can compose in the same household. So they found a home that had studios on either side of the house. And even with that, Barber saw to it to muffle Menotti's piano so that he wouldn't be distracted by hearing Menotti at the piano.
But Menotti had this penchant for throwing parties and inviting people that Barber hated. When Eugenia Bankhead showed up, brought along by her sister Tallulah, Barber locked himself in the bathroom for the duration of her stay because he just couldn't stand her. And he was locked in the bathroom for over 8 hours. They had to pass food to him through the outside window. Writing a symphony was a rite of passage, especially for an American composer of Barber's generation. Composers were after the Great American Symphony, and Barber, with only 3 orchestral works to his name at this point, wrote his first symphony when he was just 25. The one-movement symphony suggests the traditional 4-movement structure, and was modeled after similar works, possibly Franz Liszt's celebrated piano sonata, but certainly Jean Sibelius's 7th Symphony. Barber and Scolaro shared a great love of the Finnish composer, whose music was better loved in the United States and in Great Britain than the parts of Europe that Barber frequented. Barber's relative stylistic conservatism, stemming in part from his intense love of all things Europe, attracted an unusual network of conductors to his music, those who usually didn't do contemporary music, like Bruno Walter. Barber was the only then-living composer that Walter ever recorded in studio, when he conducted the New York Philharmonic in Barber's First Symphony in 1945. Barber was introduced nationwide via an hour-long concert broadcast by WJZ in February 1935. It was the first in a string of successes for a composer who was more concerned with writing for a broad and diverse audience than his more avant-garde contemporaries. Barber decried what he called their geometric cerebrations. Barber wasn't above dissonance, but he handled it carefully and did not change his style all that much as he aged, unlike, say, Aaron Copland, who abandoned diatonic Americana in later years as he fully embraced Schoenberg's 12-tone technique. But Barber's overall conservatism did not keep him from having a soft spot for the works of 12-toners Alban Berg and Luigi Dalla Piccola, as those two composers use the technique in well-crafted, personal, and highly lyrical ways. Composers on the furthest cutting edges of musical grammar and of sound production, electronic pioneers and arch serialists alike, may not have liked Barber's romantic inclinations, but at the very least could respect them. Barber's music wasn't terribly advanced, said Pierre Boulez, but at least it was honest. 12-tone writing appears in some spots in the piano sonata to highlight the work's tonal ambiguity, as well as in prayers of Kierkegaard to express the desires of humanity in contrast to the tonal music that represents the divine. In both cases, atonal structures are subservient to tonality. But there's one piece of Barber's that most people who are not even fans of classical music know, and that's the Adagio for strings, a beautiful lament for string orchestra that has become something of a soundtrack to American tragedy. In 1936, Barber produced his one and only string quartet, whose slow movement was the famous Adagio. Barber himself described this movement as a knockout. And Barber's love for early music shows up pretty strongly here, down to how the music looks on the page. The adagio would remain intact even as Barber revisited the outer movements. The first movement only needed some minor touch-ups, but the adagio was so good and so powerful that Barber never found a suitable way to follow it up. In his later years, he advised quartets to just end with the adagio. The adagio, in its larger ensemble format, was premiered by Arturo Toscanini and his NBC Symphony Orchestra, broadcasting in November 1938 from the studio that today serves as the home of Saturday Night Live.
It's a work that is recognizable by so many people who do not know who Samuel Barber is.
The adagio took off like a shot, both domestically and internationally, finding audiences in Europe in the immediate post-war years, for obvious reasons. Typically for composers for whom one work dominates in the public consciousness, Barber came to dislike the adagio and the funereal implications into which it had grown. But it's hard to hate a piece that generated, in our money, about $300,000 a year.
He tired of people telling him how much they loved the adagio, a piece he wrote when he was quite young and had gone on to write all this other music that he thought was much better than the adagio.
Toscanini was another conductor who usually avoided contemporary works and almost never touched American scores. And given his reticence to the two things that Barber couldn't help but be, he became something of a Barber champion. The adagio, and more broadly Toscanini's decision to air the works of the young American, started a fight in the musical media over what it meant to be a modern American composer. Barber's consonant, more romantic style appealed to listeners accustomed to the masterpieces of the prior century. Whether this was good or bad depends on which side of the argument you fall on.
As far as music is concerned, he's much more aligned with European trends, both past and present, than he is with American composers.
Although an American by birth, Barber had mixed feelings about his identity and perception. He enjoyed spending time in Europe and was delighted when his Italian got to the point that he was mistaken for a local. Despite his Philadelphian pedigree, he identified more as a New Englander. Barber and Menotti enjoyed touring and hobnobbing around the Old World and barely escaped right as the Second World War commenced. They landed in a Manhattan penthouse at 166 East 96th Street, where they soon took in the poet Robert William Kinch Horan. Barber and Menotti stumbled across a pale, scrawny kid in front of Saks Fifth Avenue, and when they asked him if he was all right, he told them that he'd hitchhiked from California, he was totally broke, and he'd been sleeping in Grand Central Station for 3 nights. Horan immediately enriched the intellectual life of the Barber-Menotti household, introducing them to James Joyce, Dylan Thomas, John Cage, and Alexander Calder. Horan became the dedicatee of Barber's second essay for orchestra, and like the first, Barber sought to adapt the literary form into music by developing a single musical argument. The second essay was a far bigger hit than the first, although some found it too modern and too technical, ironically enough, befitting music with such an English department title. Regardless of his American roots, and the overt Americanism of pieces like Excursions, Barber's more European attitudes made him the most sympathetic American composer to performers who typically did not play American music. One of these musicians was Vladimir Horowitz, on the shortlist for greatest pianist in human history. Barber's piano sonata, commissioned at the behest of songwriters Irving Berlin and Richard Rodgers for Horowitz, was inspired by the Russians' performances of Scriabin late into the night at Capricorn, and the pianist specifically requested a flashy but substantive finale after Barber played through the first 3 movements for him. The sonata was aristocratic, Horowitz said, but also very American.
And I think that is the only American music he ever played, aside from his own arrangement of the Star Spangled Banner.
Though Horowitz didn't keep it in his repertoire for very long, he thought highly of Barber's writing for the piano, finding him someone who knew the instrument inside and out. The implication here being that he thought a lot of Barber's contemporaries didn't know how to write for the piano. Barber was, in some sense, a throwback to a bygone era that judged the strengths and weaknesses of American music through the lens of how it would be perceived in Europe. For better or for worse, "I'm an American composer," he once said. And in an era when composers, especially in the United States, were experimenting with new philosophies of music, questioning all received wisdom, and even inventing their own instruments to fit their personal tuning systems, Barber embodied a time when composers expressed themselves through more traditional means. He was committed to tonal music, but didn't want to be a mere imitator, and so the expressive modality of late Renaissance, early Baroque Italian music was a significant inspiration. He felt that it was far more powerful and expressive than the Germanic music of the same era. And Barber had strong opinions on musical quality, and he expressed them forcefully. He admired few of the composers esteemed by the mainstream musical world. While influenced by the work of Igor Stravinsky, he noted what he heard as the Russian expatriate's shortcomings whenever he worked with longer material. And he could not stand the music of Charles Ives, nor be in the same room of anyone who dared sing his praises. It's little wonder that Barber would sympathize with the informal group of French composers called les six, especially Francis Poulenc. The two found common ground as song composers and pianists, and they performed each other's works in the medium with regularity. Barber said Poulenc was one of his only composer friends. He was rarely that close to another composer. Well, love interests like Menotti aside. Barber admitted to having a vicious jealous streak. He had a very hard time when people around him got praise. "When there were no people around Gian Carlo," Barber wrote, "we have absolutely fine times together. But there are all these people. and they just won't go away.
He could be relaxed and friendly and funny when he was with an intimate circle, but meeting strangers, he tended to be very aloof and maybe even slightly suspicious. One doesn't see him really advocating for any contemporary composers or any contemporary music. And that, of course, was in stark contrast to Copland, who was a great champion of American music and American composers. So that put Barber a little bit on the outs with his contemporary American colleagues, but had no effect on the high regard that European composers had for him.
The outbreak of the Second World War interrupted the yearly journeys to Europe that Barber had made since the summer of 1928. And despite using his connection to Catherine Biddle, wife of Attorney General Francis Biddle, to secure a desk job, he got his draft letter in August 1942. His established talents and his limited eyesight meant that he was assigned to Special Services, which was the unit that provided entertainment and recreation to the troops to keep morale high. His life was filled with tedious, boring work, and his superiors denied him a composing room away from the constant clang of typewriters. He was treated like everybody else, but that didn't stop him from being resentful about it. Barber wished that the American war effort were a little more Soviet in its employment of artists to create public-facing pro-war works. He felt as though he'd do better service to his country as a composer, what he knew how to do, supporting the effort and boosting morale on the home front than getting thrown in on the front lines, or even the desk job he had. But there was no role like that in the US. The Army only wanted music for their own bands, which gave Barber the opportunity to score for military band in his Commando March and Funeral March. After about a year in Special Services, Barber was reassigned to Texas in late summer 1943. Tarrant Field, outside Fort Worth, was commanded by General Barton Yount. Barber wanted to write a symphony about the Army Air Corps and their pilots, and word reached Yount, who had Barber reassigned to the 369th Army Air Force Band, an hour north of Capricorn, to whom Barber would occasionally report while working on the symphony at his home at Capricorn. The Flight Symphony, as the Army called it, is known to us today as his Second Symphony. It was by far Barber's most harmonically advanced piece, and its first version even used electronics in the form of a tone synthesizer in the second movement, intended to emulate the frequencies that pilots used for navigation. This synthesizer was a Bell Labs doohickey consisting of 100 discs, which all told imitated the sound of a crystal wine glass playing an A. While the same basic idea is used for sound synthesis today, the concept was a little bit too advanced for the 1940s, and it was so unreliable that Barber swapped it out for a clarinet when he revised the piece. The Flight Symphony's ambition was not lost on a press that recognized its usefulness as propaganda, frankly. The Office of War Information sent copies of the score to Allied capitals and released a recording on the military record label, but it fell out of fashion after the war. As time wore on, Barber grew decreasingly happy with what he'd written, convinced by its lack of post-war performances that it was just not a good piece. He withdrew it altogether in 1964, having become so disillusioned that he destroyed all copies of the score and parts he could find at the Schirmer offices, and he began recycling the bits of the music he liked into other projects. But in its day, the symphony was received well enough by the military's top brass to secure him a position stateside for the rest of the war. After the Flight Symphony project, Barber sought a transfer to the Office of War Information, which would prove difficult because it was a civilian agency, but Barber knew enough people who called enough favors to make that happen. He was one of many American composers to work in the office as a musical consultant, and its proximity to Mount Kisco allowed him free time at Capricorn to write his excursions for solo piano that engage with popular American styles, which he encountered in his OWI day job.
Barber even says that he wrote excursions to show that he could write American music. So it was very intentional on his part. Part of it, I think, is a genuine response to the needs and to the periods, and some of it is also related to maybe doing something different.
As first among equals among OWI composers, he served as de facto composer in residence for the organization, and wrote the neo-Baroque Capricorn Concerto at his supervisor's request.
Many people have noted that in the early 1940s, during the war, his music becomes what we would say more modernist in sound. That is, there's more of an incorporation, especially of Stravinsky. The music becomes more acerbic, more dissonant. It doesn't have that sweet and romantic lyricism that is characteristic of his work from the 30s. I mean, it still has great lyricism. Barber is a wonderful melodist and a great lyricist, but it's a little bit more tempered by kind of modernist sensibility in its textures. Some of the textures become spiky, some of the harmonies grow dissonant, and that's somewhat different from the more Brahmsian, Sibelian, lush music that he had written in the 1930s.
Like other musicians in the OWI, Barber was involved in recording sessions for overseas broadcasts, but as the premier composer on staff, he wasn't required to clock in and out as the rest were, for instance. Barber's stint in the Army delayed all sorts of projects, including a dance score for choreographer Martha Graham, who became friendly with Barber through Horan, who danced for a time in her company. Barber and Graham saw parallels between ancient mythology and their contemporary experience, which Barber reflected in the music by juxtaposing ancient modality with boogie-woogie. Never one to let a good score go to waste, Barber adapted it several times as a concert piece for full symphony orchestra. Barber would conduct ensembles sporadically for decades, but he didn't try to wear himself too thin. It sapped his time, rehearsing his own music bored him, and he didn't feel as though he had the charisma to really make a living on the guest conducting circuit. Throughout the 1940s, the ambiguous love triangle between Barber, Menotti, and Horan at Capricorn devolved.
In later years, I think after Menotti's great successes, he began to sort of lead the way. And I think that was one of the things that really caused somewhat the dissolution of the romantic relationship.
Barber and Menotti broke up and pursued other loves, even as they still cared for one another as friends and still shared a home.
They still remained very close partners, if you will, even after they had begun to become romantically involved with other people. We could date that as early as the early 1950s, or about 1950.
Little by little, he began to hate the people who loved me, Menotti said. Barber's tendency toward jealousy was kept in check as long as Menotti was his equal or lesser in fame. But Menotti, largely an opera composer, eclipsed Barber in the public eye for a time, and his work in the theatrical world kept him away from Capricorn for months on end. And while Menotti made lots of money from his operas, his spending habits meant that Barber shouldered the cost of running Capricorn. The writer Gore Vidal introduced Barber to his next love, another composer named Charles Turner.
I think the bottom line is that the music is so good. There are many conservative composers in America of that period. There are many romantic composers of that period. Howard Hansen comes to mind, for instance. He had many European composers who were great admirers of music who didn't take much interest in American music generally. I'm thinking of Vaughan Williams. I'm thinking of William Walton.
Barber was a slow worker when it came to starting a piece and finishing one by a given deadline. Commissions for one project could emerge many years later in a completely different genre. Barber's Summer Music is one of his few chamber pieces and his only wind quintet, which emerged from a Detroit Chamber Music Society commission for a piece for 3 winds, 3 strings, and piano. Barber worked with the members of the New York Woodwind Quintet to shape a piece for an ensemble with much less original repertoire than other chamber groups. Barber often collaborated with individual performers to tailor their music to both their abilities and what was possible in instruments that he did not know well.
Barber is highly unique in the history of music for attracting some of the leading conductors, instrumentalists, singers of Western classical music.
All this knowledge and collaboration didn't make his music easy. Sometimes it was the exact opposite. The New York Quintet's hornist, John Barrows, gave Barber a chart detailing the more problematic notes on each instrument, and Barrows had written etudes for the group to help them practice balancing less sonorous chords. Barber used this to his advantage because he built some of his chords in summer music solely from these harder-to-play notes, believing that it would lend the music a little bit more character. Barber sang professionally through the 1930s to help make ends meet, and up through 1940 produced songs and choruses on a very regular basis. After that, vocal music continued to be a major part of his output. Half of his music was for the voice, a proportion that began in his earliest juvenilia and continued through his whole life, explaining the lyrical charge of his instrumental music. Barber's writing in his songs shows his intimate knowledge of the human voice, with attention to registral comfort and syllabic setting, and freedom from metric regularity, inspired by his exposure to early Baroque opera. Barber set many different writers' works, but none so important to his career as those of Frederick Prokofiev and James Agee, whose Knoxville Summer of 1915 Barber would set in 1947. Agee had published it 11 years prior as a short, poetic, autobiographical short story.
Many people would say American classical music doesn't get any more American than that. I mean, you'd have to turn to maybe Aaron Copland to get musics that are comparably American in that sense.
People go by, things go by. A horse drawing a buggy, breaking his holy music on the asphalt. A loud auto, a quiet auto. People in pairs, not in a hurry, scuffling, switching out of a still body, talking casually. The taste hanging over them of vanilla, strawberry, pasteboard, and starched milk. Glitter upon them of lords and horsemen, squared with crowns in
The expressive shifts between major and minor, a penchant for hemiola, are both hallmarks of Brahms' music, and Barber's aversion to writing program music mirrored Brahms' belief in the superiority of absolute music, that is, music that represents nothing except itself. Barber was careful to caution against programmatic readings of pieces like The School for Scandal or the Second Symphony, while also having an aversion to talking about his music in general.
I think he didn't want to be pinned down to anything really specific about his music. He really did want the music to speak for itself. He does occasionally talk about his music, but for the most part, he's pretty reticent about it.
When pressed, Barber would give some vague answers, like saying the third essay was inspired by a literary form, and agreeing with the Oxford Dictionary's definition of the word essay, and not much about that piece besides.
Menotti is more forthcoming about both his music and Barber's music, so Menotti remains an interesting source for learning more about Barber's intentions.
Horan wrote in 1943 that Barber was looking for something away from three-part sonata form structure, preferring various two-part forms that share distinct orchestration choices, things like auxiliary wind instruments, brass mutes, and divided strings. The essays are an extension of his love of literature with his love of absolute music. This stands in contrast to the earlier genre of the tone poem, which uses literary allusions for extra-musical, programmatic connotations. The essay allowed him to write one-movement orchestral pieces that were not tied to existing one-movement traditions. Rather, like literary essays, every melodic idea supports, extrapolates, or is otherwise drawn from the initial thematic material. He didn't like analysis, and he preferred surrounding himself with performers rather than other composers. When writing for a particular performer, he would invite that performer to Capricorn to play their whole repertoire for him, sometimes going for 5 hours straight. And when he was locked in, he was locked in. He'd be so focused on his music that when he was working on the piano sonata, he went to the dentist, and he didn't realize the dentist had stuffed his mouth with cotton balls until hours later he decided that he wanted to eat something. Barber was good for about one piece a year for most of his career, unless he was working with text. His most fruitful professional relationship with any singer was with Leontine Price, who premiered Barber's Hermit songs.
Pity me on my pilgrimage to Lockdock, O King of the churches and the bells, bewailing your sorrows and your wounds, but not a tear can I squeeze from my eyes. That poison and I, after so much sin, pity me, O King. What shall I do with a heart that seeks only its own ease? Oh, only begotten Son, by whom all men were made, who shunned not the death by 3 wounds. Pity me on my pilgrimage to Lockdock. Alive with a heart not softer than a stone. Sweet little bell, struck on a windy night, I would liefer keep tryst with thee than be with a light and foolish born one.
After that cycle's success, Barber and Price attempted to embark on a dual career as recital partners, inspired by Pollack and his recital partner, the baritone Pierre Bernac, but they didn't receive enough invitations to get this off the ground. Price was the soloist in Prayers of Kierkegaard, the intended soloist in Andromache's Farewell, and created the role of Cleopatra in Barber's opera Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra was not Barber's first opera. That was Vanessa, with libretto by Menotti, a rare contemporary American premiere by the Metropolitan Opera, which won its composer the first of his 2 Pulitzer Prizes. In keeping with Barber's internationalism, Vanessa was also the first American-written and English-language opera done at the Salzburg Festival, where European audiences found it too musically conservative while also not bringing anything truly American to the table. It was squarely in the European grand opera tradition, a conscious look backwards to a bygone romanticism at a time when post-war European tastes were moving towards modernist abstraction. The hostile response from the old world may have kept Barber from working with Menotti again for Antony and Cleopatra.
Perhaps because of some personal things, perhaps because of Barber's own doubts about Menotti as a librettist. It's hard to know.
It was Vanessa's astounding American success that led to the Met to use Ford Foundation money to commission Antony and Cleopatra for the opening of their new opera house in 1966, part of a revival in the New York performing arts scene that had led to Barber's Piano Concerto, his second Pulitzer winner, being commissioned for the opening festivities of Lincoln Center.
The Antony and Cleopatra story is a fascinating one in terms of Barber's career. When the new Met was built, there was pressure placed on Rudolph Bing to have an American opera, at least in the season. And as it turned out, the decision was to actually have it open the opera house. Barber had proved himself very capable of writing an opera, but the pressure brought to bear for this opening night of the greatest opera house in the world, probably at the time, the Grand Metropolitan Opera, was enormous. And it was a kind of attention, the likes of which so few composers ever achieve in their lifetime. And Barber himself was somewhat reluctant to take it on because he knew how risky this whole project was going to be. He said his friends would be very disappointed in him if he didn't take this commission, so he took the commission.
The play's 42 scenes give productions a hard time on the theatrical stage, let alone an operatic one. Especially one, as Barber did, that only used Shakespeare's own words, as Barber was entranced with the bard's poetry.
It was really Rudolph Bing who promoted the idea that Franco Zeffirelli, the Italian director, collaborate with him on the libretto. In the end, it was not a happy collaboration.
With round-the-clock work and last-minute orchestration assistance from composer Lee Hoiby, Barber completed the piece a mere 2 weeks before the premiere. The untested equipment behind the mammoth production broke and buckled, forcing Zeffirelli out of his depth in an original production to reimagine these big battle scenes.
One of the things that Franco Zeffirelli did with all the resources he had at this enormous new opera house was overproduce the opera.
That Antony and Cleopatra would open the brand new Met meant drawing a crowd there to see a historic event, a spectacle, and Zeffirelli was more than happy to try to oblige that. He wanted to make the grandest opera ever to grace the American stage. Barber's music, by contrast, was practically a chamber piece, and the Met's management sided with the director's vision, come hell or high water.
There's a lot of lore about Antony and Cleopatra, one of which is that everything went wrong on opening night. Opening night actually went very well, and you could hear enormous cheers and bravos at the end of the opera.
Price, who had devoted a year of her life to learning this part, was stuck in elaborate, uncomfortable costumes. The premiere was a success as far as the star-studded audience was concerned, but the piece has gained a reputation as a failure due to its overly lavish, deeply troubled production, which overshadowed any criticism of the music itself.
Between the hoopla over the opening of the Met and all the celebrities there and the artists and the politicians there and the overproduction of the work, the music really got lost. And this was, of course, a great disappointment to Barber to have his music not well served, music he had worked so hard on, not well served by the production and by the mood and atmosphere of opening night. Because it's in some ways, it's a very introspective and deep piece. I don't know what people were expecting. They may have expected something more festive or joyous. Many of the people there were maybe not opera lovers to begin with. So it was not an ideal situation for the reception.
Barber left as he had previously planned for Europe after the world premiere, but these plans were unbeknownst to the press, and were misinterpreted as Barber fleeing from the disaster zone, and the composer was perplexed to receive notes of sympathy while he was in Europe. His trip to Europe wasn't just planned, it had more to do with him being burnt out, fulfilling commissions, no longer needing the money, than with shame over a botched premiere.
The portrayal of Antony and Cleopatra as a failure must be qualified. It received many good reviews, and even the bad reviews recognized the fact that the production didn't do the music any favors and reserved judgment on the work as a whole.
Purely musical criticism of the work, difficult to come by through the reporting on the opera as a spectacle, criticized Barber for suppressing his lyrical and romantic inclinations, the very same aspects of his style that got Vanessa torn to shreds in Europe. Sometimes you just can't win. But there is something to the idea that Antony and Cleopatra was more like a high watermark. Statistically, his career receded after the premiere, and the criticism did seem to get to him. His friend Gian Carlo said that Barber was perpetually unhappy after the fiasco, and his publisher went so far as to call it a catastrophe. Throughout the latter half of the 1960s, performances of Barber's orchestral music fell off, and his compositional output dropped as well. He would only write 9 more pieces afterwards, for a number of different reasons.
In the wake of Antony and Cleopatra, he wrote some really marvelous music. And then one does find his output begin to trail off. And that has various reasons, but probably the larger reasons than anything that happened to do with Antony and Cleopatra is the fact that he had to sell his home in Capricorn. He had to move to New York City. He didn't like living in New York City. And he always said he was a country composer, that he was inspired by the country. So here he was living in New York, which was not a congenial place for him to be composing. And then he started to suffer health problems, serious health problems.
Contemporary politics had something to do with it too. That he and many of his collaborators on Antony and Cleopatra were gay was fodder for media insinuations, and a piece that followed, Barber's setting of Pablo Neruda's sensuous poetry called The Lovers, raised questions not only about the raunchiness of the text, but also about what the poet's communist affiliations meant for Barber, if anything. Barber was pretty apolitical, but since when do facts stop media speculation?
like a tunnel, the birds flew from me, and now I swam me with his flashing in the hand. To survive myself, I fought fuel like a weapon. I can arrow in my bow, a stone in my sleeve. For a vengeance, first and I love you, body of skin, of mass, of vigor and milk, of the goblets of the breast, for the eyes of absence, for the roses of the pubis, oh, your voice, oh, and sad. Body of my woman, I will persist in your grave. With this what I promise, this time I should be proud. Dark through the bed, when the eternal thirst flows, and weariness follows, and the infinite
Pieces like The Lovers, Photograph of a Western Scene, A Piano Ballade, and a third and final orchestral essay dotted a life slowed by age, disillusionment, and finally illness, multiple myeloma, complications from which claimed his life in January 1981. He was 70 years old.
Even at the very end of his life, he leaves the canzonetta for oboe and strings. It's his swan song written at the very end of his life, and it's played by oboists all the time. He and Gershwin and Copland are the three most played American composers since probably the 1930s. Almost 100 years later, they remain unbalanced. When you think of it in the course of 100 years, the three most played American classical composers. I mean, there are some rivals, of course, Charles Ives being one, and in more recent years, John Adams and Philip Glass and Steve Reich and so forth. But as far as mainstream classical music goes, he early established himself as a leading American composer and remained that way throughout his whole life, and remains that way today. Another myth about Barber, incidentally, is that he was not appreciated in his time because of his relatively conservative and romantic outlook. And that, again, is a myth. He was throughout his life lionized by the establishment, by music critics. He gets, near the end of his life, the gold medal from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He was a very highly regarded composer.
Barber's New York Times obituary said that he had been hounded by success. As self-critical as he was, the term hounded is especially apt. Composing, unless in the rare throes of creativity, was an agonizing experience for him, evidenced by finishing his career shy of Opus 50, and Menotti spoke of the many times that he had to hound Barber to make necessary revisions to recent premieres, to really make the pieces sparkle. He gave generously of himself and his fortune to help others, in contrast to his sense of humor, which would often poke fun at others and push them away. He was a jealous introvert who craved interesting company. On one hand, Samuel Barber was an American composer. Few, if any, works capture a sense of Americana better than Knoxville Summer of 1915, which alone should secure Barber's place in the history books. But on the other hand, his music is broader than that. He found success and sympathy in Europe, attracted performers who didn't do modern American music, and at times expressed a deep dislike, dissatisfaction with being an American. His tastes and his musical style opened up some doors to him that were closed to his contemporaries, but vice versa. The lyrical power and depth of his best works show the universality of musical expression. But he was not, as his biographer Barbara Heyman put it, part of the mainstream's quest for a national identity. His unabashed influence from Italian and German models, especially early music, shine through in an intensely personal style. To say that Barber was not an American composer is to assume that American identity is something new, something sui generis. Barber's music in dialogue with the models that shaped it is only problematic, only un-American, if you buy into that assumption. Barber has been lumped in with backwards-looking neo-romantics, which doesn't account for the modernist procedures that he used, most notably those tone rows in the piano sonata and his later solo piano nocturne. Neo-romanticism is a label that his contemporaries rejected. For Horan, Barber was a pure voice in a musical landscape defined by frauds and esoteric styles. There was nothing neo about Barber's romanticism. In other words, Horan saw in Barber a revolutionary conservative who stuck to his guns even as the winds of eclectic modernism blew around him. For Virgil Thomson, Barber was a new school academic composer. Others pointed to a subtle sea change in the 1940s as Barber adopted techniques from modernism that betrayed the times in which he lived. Given the overwhelming popularity of the Adagio for strings especially, the musically literate and lay public alike have a warped view of Barber. After all, if you only ever hear one piece, you'll think that's all the composer ever did. But more than that, the Adagio highlights the liminal space in which Barber and his legacy live, between those who wanted American art to divest from the past and from European models, and a lay public who fell for Barber's beautiful embrace of tonality. Copeland pointed this out, highlighting the beauty of Barber's work, as well as its place outside the overall progressive trend that defined the American art music mainstream. He seemed almost too safe, Copeland said in a 1981 interview.
The 1980s may have been a nadir. There may have been a real loss of interest. But one finds a great upsurge of interest in his music, I would say in the 1990s, continuing to our own time. The number of recordings that have come out of Barber's music is just extraordinary. And much of that discography postdates 1990. Virtually all his music is in print. All his music has been recorded. Virtually all his music is played.
From his earliest musical mentorship under Sidney Homer, Barber wanted to write music not for the few, but for the many. Orchestras love to play his music because it is mentally challenging, noted Leontine Price. It falls intellectually to the mind and beautifully on the ear, which is a rare combination.
I was driving along in my car. It's raining, and the sky is cloudy, really gloomy, and I'm driving in my car, and I hear this music, and it goes like this. Builds to this peak. And as it gets to that peak, the sun shoots out of the clouds, and it stops raining, and the traffic clears up. I had to pull over. What's happening to me? I lost control. I just lost it. What happened? And I realized that this is what I love about music. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to create. This is what I've always tried to create. And I hope before I can't write anymore that I create music like that.